Well, our next guest doesn't need much of an introduction to this audience. But to those who don't know, Todd Starnes, a best-selling author, nationally syndicated radio host, spent well over a decade at Fox News as well and did outstanding work there. And he's now based at KWAM News Talk there in Memphis. He's on his own. He's doing great work. And he was kind enough to have us on for a couple times after the Super Bowl parade shooting that took place a few weeks ago. He's got a new book out as well. Just came out. It's called Twilight's Last Gleaming, Can America Be Saved? And the thing I really liked about it as I was reading through it is that the reality is we do face difficult days, but not hopeless days. And that's one thing I hear too much of there's no hope, it's over, it's done with, the country can't be saved. And I've never believed that. I don't buy into it. And Todd Starnes, I'm glad you don't either. Good morning.
Pete, good morning. Always great to hang out with you, sir. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So take me through that. You know, I understand we are facing tough times in this country. You address that in this book. But these aren't hopeless days either. These are not hopeless times. How important is that message as you get that across in this new book?
Well, I think it has to be the message. And I noticed about a year and a half ago when I was starting to work on the book and write the book that a lot of our listeners seemed dejected. They seemed like, hope was lost and the country was doomed. And I try to push back on that a lot because ultimately we are the ones who control our own destiny. Now, I'm not an idiot. I can certainly see that we're living in some very dark and ominous times. But the reality is that we are because of our votes. Many people stayed home and did not participate in the election process. So I think when good people stand down and do nothing, bad things happen. And, of course, we saw a great example of that over the weekend when the Biden administration decided we were going to celebrate transgenderism instead of Easter.
I know. I mean, I saw that Friday into Saturday, and I thought to myself, when they tell you who they are, Todd, believe them. And this just feels like the latest example of that, does it not?
No, it does. There's a chapter in the book, Jack and Jill went up the hill and came down gender neutral. And we talk about transgenderism and try to have a little bit of fun in the process. There is a lot of humor in this book. And, the reality is that the whole transgender movement is based on this one idea, that God made a mistake. Now, we believe, if you're a person of faith, you believe that God created male and female. The transgender movement believes that God made a mistake, and you can, identify however you want to identify. So really, when you look at what's happening in our country, and it doesn't matter if it's politics, it doesn't matter if it's the culture, the problem is not a political issue. The problem is, I believe, a spiritual issue. And we've got to really get back to the faith of our founding fathers. And that's the call to action in the book.
How do you see, we have seen, and there's been a ton of research on this, Pew Research and all these other firms have done this, and they've shown really a decrease in religion in this country, an increase in things that people care about, like money and material needs and things of that nature. How, as people start to read this book and as you talk about it and think about it today, how do we start reversing that trend, Todd Starnes?
Well, it's going to require moms and dads making the effort to get their kids back in church and Sunday school. That's the biggest problem we're facing right now in the country. We've lost absolute truth. We've lost our moral foundations, and now we really have been adrift, and we've been adrift for a very long time. I take people back into the book into the 1960s when Ronald Reagan and William F. Buckley Jr. were really, creating what is now the modern conservative movement. And of course, what were they fighting back in the 50s and 60s? They were fighting the communists. And I contend that we're fighting that same sort of enemy today in America. We're fighting the communists. But Buckley and Reagan both framed the argument and the fight not as a political fight, but as a religious fight, good versus evil, right versus wrong. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have been so unsuccessful as a nation in stopping this communist infestation, especially in our public education system, because we're trying to fight it politically and not from a moral position.
It's an excellent point. Todd Starnes is on the show. His new book, Twilight's Last Gleaming, Can America Be Saved? He's joining us on 95.7 FM KCMO. So when you go back to that period in time, and you're right, it became this moral conversation of right versus wrong. How can that be used effectively today, whether it's with Donald Trump or anybody running for local office in the Kansas City area?
Well, I get it. President Trump's not a pastor, wouldn't make a good Sunday school teacher, probably wouldn't make a good deacon in my local Baptist church. That's okay. I'm good there. I need a guy who can lead us. Well, then again, he might make a good deacon. I don't know if you've been to a business meeting at a Baptist church. It gets a little wild and hairy. But we need a man who's going to lead us. And one of the things I really appreciated about President Trump, and he was very gracious, invited me to Mar-a-Lago, and we sat down for 2 hours and really had a great conversation about this. And the reality is, he's a guy who said, you know what, I'm not an evangelical, but I am going to stand up and defend you guys, and I'm going to bring your people to the table. And he did. So I appreciate him doing that and understanding that there is a religious component to the founding of our nation and to the success of our nation, which, by the way, is why Trump got so much heat last week. It wasn't that he was promoting a Bible, which, by the way, is not a new Bible. It's been out for several years. But I think he got the heat because he called on Americans to get back to church, to get back to God. And he said, if we want to make America great again, we've got to start praying. And I think that set off, that triggered the left.
You know, but you're right to point out a lot of people struggle on the left, and then, you know, a handful on the right as well, with Donald Trump and who he is and how he lived his life and how he's lived his life versus, of course, you know, the evangelical movement that has maybe not embraced him largely, but certainly has chosen him and voted for him of the two options that have existed the last couple of election cycles. What would Todd Starnes say to that as people kind of look at that from afar and try to figure out how it makes sense?
Well, for one thing, we have not applied that standard to any of our other presidents. And I do recall Barack Obama attending a church and being a member of a church that was literally condemning America, the chickens coming home to roost. So yeah. I think you have to look at the man's record. He's the only president in American history to literally stand before tens of thousands of people at the annual March for Life in Washington, D.C. He's been, I would argue, the most pro-life president in at least modern American history because of the policies that he implemented. Look at the justices that he put on the Supreme Court. Could you imagine if Hillary Clinton would have won the election? The Supreme Court would be gone. It would be over. So you know, I think people need to think long and hard about staying home or not voting or writing in, you know, Ron DeSantis' name or Nikki Haley's name. They need to understand that we truly are at an inflection point in history. And if we don't get this right, I really am, at that point, I would be concerned about the direction of the country. But as, you know, I quote John Adams in the book, in 1776 wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail. And of course, it was chaos then. I would contend it was more chaotic then than it was now in this country. And he said, in spite of the gloom, I still see the rays of ravishing light and glory. And I think that really has to be our rally cry, is that even when we get knocked down, we've got to dust ourselves up. We've got to get back up, and we have to keep fighting because, there's really no other place to go. This is it.
Mm-hmm. Todd, I want to end it on this question, and you alluded to a little bit of it there. The pro-life movement that, let's be honest, since Roe got overturned, has gotten its clock cleaned almost every time at the ballot box, including here in Kansas 2 years ago. How does that tide start to turn, and what is the answer politically versus morally?
Well, and I'm glad you pointed that out because there are distinctions there. And I think the pro-life movement, and I am rabidly pro-life, but I'm also pragmatic about things from a political standpoint. And when the professional politicians who have been defending you over the years and who have been voting pro-life over the years come and tell you, pro-life groups, now is not the time to advance this legislation, I think the pro-life movement needs to step back and listen to the political experts at that point. And honestly, we also have a serious messaging problem with the entire issue, and that needs to be fixed. Look, I think there are ways to do this, and you're right, the fight is back in the at the state level, which is where it should be. But what are we doing, Pete? Now all of a sudden there's an effort to federalize it. Well, I thought the whole fight over the generations was to make it a state issue. So we, again, got to get it together, marketing and talking about our communications wing. And I think at that point we will win the day.
The book, Twilight's Last Gleaming, Can America Be Saved? Todd Starnes on KCMO. Go pick it up. The book just came out here in the last week or so. Todd, keep up the great work. Thanks for all you're doing on the national level, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.
Pete, appreciate you. Thanks now.
All right, Todd Starnes, very well done. Pick up your copy. Twilight's Last Gleaming, Can America Be Saved?